Phoenix is one of the great improbable cities of the modern world, a metropolis of millions sprawling across the Sonoran Desert, a place where summer temperatures soar past 110 degrees and rain is a rare visitor, and yet where lawns grow green, pools shimmer, and fountains play. This city exists because of water carried from far away across the desert to sustain a population in a place that could never have supported it on its own. But that water is now in question, because Arizona is losing a crucial part of its supply, the Colorado River, which has been shrinking under drought, a warming climate, and demand that has long outstripped what the river can provide. And so a serious question hangs over the future of this desert giant. What happens to Phoenix if the river keeps falling? This is the story of Phoenix and its water, of how the city gets what it needs, of why it stands so exposed to the decline of the Colorado, and of what could actually happen as the river continues to shrink. Before we begin, one honest word. To ask what happens if the river keeps falling is not to predict that Phoenix will suddenly run dry or empty out. The city has real buffers and has prepared in important ways, but it does face genuine and serious challenges, and understanding them clearly reveals the true shape of the water crisis confronting one of America's fastest-growing cities. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going: hitting subscribe. If you are finding this important, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your city or state in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. How Phoenix actually gets its water. To understand what happens to Phoenix if the river keeps falling, you first have to understand where the city's water actually comes from, because the answer is more complex and in some ways more reassuring than many people realize. Phoenix does not depend on a single source of water, but on several. And this diversity is one of the most important facts about the city's situation. The first great source is the Colorado River, carried to central Arizona through an enormous canal system that lifts and moves the water hundreds of miles across the desert to reach the metropolitan area. This Colorado River water is a major part of the supply, and it is the part most directly threatened by the river's decline. But Phoenix has other sources as well. A second major supply comes from the rivers that rise in the mountains of central Arizona, gathered and stored in a system of reservoirs and delivered to the metropolitan area, a source that is local to Arizona and independent of the Colorado. A third source is groundwater, the water stored beneath the ground in aquifers, which the city can pump to supplement its surface supplies, particularly in times of shortage. And the city also reuses and recycles water, stretching its supply further. This diversity of sources is Phoenix's great strength, because it means the city does not depend entirely on the vulnerable Colorado River. And if that source is cut, it has others to fall back upon. Understanding this is essential to understanding what happens if the river falls, because Phoenix is not a single source city teetering on the edge of one shrinking supply, but a city with a diversified portfolio of water, a portfolio that gives it real resilience even as one of its major sources comes under threat. This is the foundation on which any honest assessment of the city's future must rest. It is worth appreciating how deliberately this diversity was built, because it did not happen by accident. Phoenix and the surrounding region have been shaped by generations of people who understood that survival in the desert depended on water, and who worked, sometimes over the course of a century or more, to secure and diversify the supplies that would sustain a great city. The system of reservoirs on the local rivers was built long ago to capture the mountain runoff and store it against the dry seasons, and the Great Canal that brings Colorado River water across the desert was one of the largest public works projects of its era, undertaken precisely to add another leg to the city's water supply. This long history of investment and foresight is why Phoenix today has more than one source to rely upon, and it stands in contrast to cities that gambled everything on a single supply. The diversity of Phoenix's water is a legacy, an inheritance from those who came before and who understood the desert's hard bargain, and it is one of the most valuable assets the city possesses as it confronts the decline of the river. The junior priority problem yet, for all its diversity of sources, Phoenix faces a specific and serious vulnerability in the way it receives its Colorado River water, and this vulnerability is at the heart of the challenge. The water that Arizona draws from the Colorado through its Great Canal holds what is called a junior priority, meaning that in the order in which the river's water is allocated. Arizona's canal water stands behind that of some other users, and when shortages are declared and cuts must be made, this junior water is reduced first. This is not because Arizona is less deserving or less careful, but because of a historic bargain struck decades ago, in which Arizona agreed to subordinate its canal water to California's rights in order to secure the federal support needed to build the canal in the first place. That bargain, made in an era when the shortages seemed distant and unlikely, has become the defining vulnerability of Arizona's Colorado River supply now that the shortages have arrived. It means that as the river falls and reductions are imposed, Arizona's canal water is among the first on the entire river to be cut, and Phoenix, which receives a portion of that water, is exposed to these early and deepening reductions. The cuts so far have fallen most heavily on agriculture, which uses much of the canal water and holds the most junior position, sparing the cities the worst of the reductions for now. But as the river continues to fall, the pressure moves closer to the cities, and the junior priority means that Arizona's urban supply from the Colorado could face real reductions in the harsher scenarios. This junior priority problem is what makes Phoenix's exposure to the river's decline so much sharper than that of some other cities, and it is the central reason the question of what happens if the river keeps falling is so pressing for this particular city. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Before today, did you realize Phoenix gets its water from several different sources, not just the Colorado River? Drop a yes or no in the comments, because your reactions help us understand what surprises people most, and I read every reply. Okay, back to it. What happens as the river falls? Step by step what actually happens to Phoenix as the Colorado River keeps falling? The answer unfolds not as a single dramatic event, but as a series of escalating stages, each corresponding to a deeper level of shortage, and understanding this progression is the key to understanding the city's future. In the earlier stages of shortage, which have already arrived, the cuts fall primarily on agriculture and on the most junior users, and the cities, with their higher priority within the state and their other sources, are largely shielded from direct reductions in their supply. At this stage, Phoenix continues to receive its water, leaning on its diverse sources and its stored reserves, and the effects are felt more by the farms than by the city's residents. As the river falls further and the shortages deepen, the pressure intensifies, and the reductions begin to reach beyond agriculture toward the city's share of the Colorado River water. At this point, Phoenix would lean more heavily on its other sources, on the rivers of central Arizona and on its groundwater, to make up for the reduced Colorado supply, drawing down the reserves it has stored and pumping more from the aquifers beneath it. This is where the city's diversification and its stored water become crucial, because they provide the buffer that allows it to absorb the loss of Colorado River water without an immediate crisis. In the most severe stages, if the river fell to the deepest levels and the cuts grew truly harsh, Phoenix would face harder choices, relying more heavily on its groundwater and its other supplies, intensifying its conservation and confronting real limits on the water available for growth and for the less essential uses. Even then, the essential water supply for the city's residents would be defended, drawn from the combination of sources and reserves the city has assembled. The progression is one of escalating stress rather than sudden collapse, a gradual tightening that tests the city's buffers and its adaptability. And the question is not whether Phoenix would instantly run dry, but how deeply the stress would reach and how well the city could absorb it. The buffers that protect the city, to appreciate why Phoenix is more resilient than its exposure to the Colorado might suggest, we have to look closely at the buffers the city has built, because they are the reason the question of the falling river is one of serious challenge rather than certain catastrophe. The first and most important buffer is the diversity of sources we have already described. The fact that Phoenix draws on the local rivers and on groundwater in addition to the Colorado, so that the loss of one source does not leave the city without water. The second is the enormous quantity of water that Arizona has stored underground for exactly this kind of emergency, having spent years directing Colorado River water into the aquifers in wetter times, banking it beneath the ground as a reserve to be drawn upon when the surface supply is cut. This stored water is a hidden savings account, a buffer that can help sustain the city through years of shortage. The scale of this underground storage is considerable, representing years of water set aside for exactly the kind of emergency the region now faces. And it reflects a far-sighted policy of saving in the good years to prepare for the bad ones. Like any savings account, however, it is finite, and drawing on it too heavily or for too long would deplete it, so it is best understood as a bridge, a way to carry the city through a period of shortage while other adjustments are made, rather than a permanent substitute for the lost river water. Still, having such a reserve is an enormous advantage, one that many places facing water shortages lack entirely, and it is a testament to the seriousness with which Arizona has approached the management of its water. Beyond these physical buffers, Phoenix and Arizona have built protections into the very rules that govern growth and water use. The state requires, in its major urban areas, that new development demonstrate an assured supply of water for a long period into the future before it can proceed, a rule designed to prevent the city from growing beyond what its water can sustain. Phoenix has also been a leader in managing its groundwater, working to protect the aquifers from the kind of reckless overpumping that has depleted groundwater elsewhere, so that the underground reserves remain available as a genuine buffer rather than being exhausted. And the city has invested in conservation, in recycling water, and in planning carefully for a drier future. Together, these buffers, the diverse sources, the banked groundwater, the growth rules, and the conservation, give Phoenix a real capacity to weather the decline of the Colorado, a set of defenses assembled over decades by people who understood that the desert would eventually test the city's water. What happens to Phoenix if the river keeps falling depends enormously on these buffers, and they are the reason the city faces the crisis from a stronger position than many assume. Quick pause, because this matters and deserves to be seen. If you are getting value from this, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more people. And if you have family or friends in Arizona or anywhere in the Southwest, share this with them, because it is genuinely important to understand what is happening to the water they depend on. One like, one share to someone you care about, and let's keep going. The vulnerable edges of the metropolis, for all of Phoenix's buffers, it would be a mistake to conclude that the city and its region are uniformly protected, because the metropolitan area has vulnerable edges, places where the exposure to the water crisis is far sharper than in the well-supplied core. And these edges reveal the real risks of the falling river. On the fringes of the metropolitan area, and some of the newer and more far-flung communities, there are places that depend heavily or even entirely on groundwater, lacking the diverse sources and the secure supplies that the central city enjoys. These communities are far more exposed to the crisis, because if their groundwater is drawn down, or if they cannot secure other supplies, they face the prospect of real shortages in a way that the core of Phoenix does not. Indeed, the limits of water have already begun to constrain growth on the edges of the region, as concerns about the long-term availability of groundwater have led to restrictions on new development in some areas that could not demonstrate an assured supply. This is a striking and important development, because it shows that the water crisis is not merely a future threat, but is already shaping where and how the metropolitan area can grow, drawing a real boundary around the expansion that has defined Phoenix for generations. There have already been cases in the region where communities on the fringe, dependent on hauled water or on wells, have faced the alarming reality of their supply being threatened or cut off, forced to scramble for alternatives when the water they had counted on was no longer assured. These episodes, though affecting relatively small numbers of people compared to the great city, are a vivid warning of what it means to sit on the most exposed edge of the water crisis. And they show that the danger of running short is not merely hypothetical, but has already touched some of the most vulnerable places in the region. The vulnerable edges of the metropolis are where the abstract crisis becomes concrete, where the falling river and the limits of groundwater translate into actual constraints on communities and development. They are a reminder that within the broader resilience of Phoenix lie pockets of real vulnerability, and that the effects of the falling river will not be felt evenly across the region, but will strike hardest at the places with the least secure supplies. What happens to Phoenix, then, is partly a question of what happens to these exposed edges. and of how the region manages the uneven distribution of its water security. The growth question at the heart of it all, underlying the entire question of Phoenix's water future, is the matter of growth, because Phoenix has been one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country, and the tension between that relentless growth and the limits of its water is at the very heart of the crisis. For generations, Phoenix has expanded outward across the desert, adding people, homes, and businesses at a remarkable pace, and this growth has been a source of prosperity and pride. But every new resident and every new development adds to the demand for water, and as the Colorado River falls and the limits of the other supplies become clearer, the fundamental question arises of whether the city can continue to grow as it has, or whether its expansion must eventually be constrained by the water available. This is perhaps the deepest challenge that the falling river poses to Phoenix, not the immediate threat of the taps running dry, which the city's buffers make unlikely in the near term, but the longer-term question of whether the era of unlimited growth is coming to an end. The rules requiring an assured water supply for new development are, in effect, an acknowledgement that growth cannot outrun water forever, and the constraints already appearing on the fringes are a sign of what may lie ahead. Phoenix faces the prospect of having to bring its growth into balance with its water, of managing its expansion within the limits of what its diminishing supplies can sustain, a profound shift for a city built on the assumption of endless expansion. What happens to Phoenix if the river keeps falling is therefore, in large part, a question about the future of its growth, about whether the city can find a way to continue thriving while living within the real limits of its water, and about how it will manage the difficult transition from a culture of boundless expansion to one of careful stewardship in an age of scarcity. All right, I know, second time I am bringing this up, feel free to sigh at me. But quickly, if you have made it this deep into a video about Phoenix and its water, you clearly find this stuff fascinating, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel like ours. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time. Promise. Let's finish. The heat that makes everything harder there is a further dimension to Phoenix's water challenge that cannot be ignored, and that is the extreme heat of the city itself, which both increases the demand for water and reflects the warming climate that is shrinking the river in the first place. Phoenix is one of the hottest major cities in the country, enduring long summers of punishing temperatures, and this heat drives a substantial demand for water to keep landscapes alive, to fill pools, to cool buildings, and to sustain life in an environment that is fundamentally hostile to it, as the climate warms and the summers grow longer and hotter. This demand for water tends to rise even as the supply falls, a cruel scissors that squeezes the city from both directions at once. The same warming that reduces the flow of the Colorado also intensifies the heat that makes Phoenix so thirsty, tying the two challenges together in a way that deepens the overall stress. This connection between heat and water is important, because it means that Phoenix's water challenge cannot be separated from the broader warming that is reshaping the region's climate. A hotter future is also a thirstier one, and the pressures on the city's water are likely to grow not only because the river is falling, but because the demand is rising with the heat. This makes conservation all the more essential, and it raises the stakes of the effort to use water wisely, because every degree of additional warming makes the balance between supply and demand harder to maintain. The heat that defines Phoenix is thus not separate from its water crisis, but deeply intertwined with it, a reminder that the challenges facing the desert city are connected, each amplifying the other, and that meeting them will require confronting the warming climate that lies beneath them both. Understanding this connection is essential to understanding the full scope of what happens to Phoenix as the river falls, because the falling river and the rising heat are two faces of the same underlying change. The honest answer to the question. So, what happens to Phoenix if the river keeps falling? Having looked at the sources, the vulnerabilities, and the buffers, we can offer an honest answer, one that is neither the panic of impending doom nor the complacency of assuming all is well. The honest answer is that Phoenix is far more resilient than its exposure to the Colorado might suggest, protected by its diverse sources. Its banked groundwater, its growth rules, and its conservation so that the immediate prospect of the city running dry is genuinely unlikely, and the essential water supply for its residents is well defended even in harsh scenarios. The city has prepared, over decades, for exactly the kind of challenge it now faces, and those preparations give it a real capacity to weather the decline of the river. This is the reassuring part of the answer, and it deserves to be stated clearly because the alarming headlines can obscure the genuine strength of the city's position. It is easy, amid the dramatic images of falling reservoirs and cracked earth, to imagine that a city like Phoenix stands on the edge of sudden collapse, but the reality is that the essential water on which people depend for drinking, cooking, and daily life is among the most protected of the city's supplies, defended by layers of sources and reserves that would not vanish even in a severe shortage. Recognizing this matters because unfounded panic serves no one, and the true challenge is better met with clear understanding than with fear. But the honest answer also acknowledges the real challenges. Phoenix faces the loss of a major source of water, deepening reductions as the river falls, growing pressure on its groundwater and its other supplies, real vulnerability on its exposed edges, and above all the profound question of whether it can continue to grow within the limits of its diminishing water. These are serious challenges, and meeting them will require sustained effort, difficult choices, and a willingness to adapt to a future of less water. The falling river will test Phoenix as never before, forcing it to conserve, to manage its groundwater with care, to balance its growth against its supplies, and to cooperate with the other users of the Colorado to share the shortage. What happens to Phoenix, in the end, depends on how well it meets these challenges, on whether it can build on its buffers and its preparation to adapt to the new reality. Phoenix is not a city on the brink of running dry, but it is a city facing a genuine reckoning, a great desert metropolis that must learn to live within the limits of its water even as the river that helped create it continues to fall. Its response will be one of the defining tests of whether the modern desert cities can endure in an age of scarcity. And its story is a powerful reminder that even the most improbable of cities must, in the end, reckon with the hard limits of the water that sustains it. What Phoenix decides and how well it adapts will be watched far beyond Arizona, because it is one of the clearest examples anywhere of a great city confronting the limits of its water and the lessons it learns, whether of success or of struggle, will matter to every other place that must one day face the same reckoning. The falling river is testing Phoenix now, and how the city answers will help write the